Hi, this is Julie Baines, and welcome to my ethnic genogram presentation. I have a hard copy of this, and this is to April 10th, 2013, to Professor Jenny Brin for DNA class. Thanks for allowing me to do this via video. I chose a little different perspective on the ethnic genogram. Instead of going with a race, I went with faith or religious activities that may have carried on through the generations in my family. I want to start just by explaining the key really quick so you can look at the different color codes on the chart and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Heavy-handed discipline was carried through each generation, and that's the purple dots. And then children being seen and not heard is the black line. And then the X stands for racist. Now, some of my family was racist against colors. Some were religious, had religious racism. Some of them may have had a gender racism. And then when events happened like 9/11, there was a racism that came apart then as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take you back to my maternal and paternal great-grandparents. And it's starting in late 1800s, early 1900s. Through my research, I found out that both William Boss, my maternal great-grandfather, and Claude Bickley, my paternal great-grandfather, were Methodist ministers. Methodism believes they're gospelers who concluded that evolution shouldn't be used to exploit people, but instead Anglo-Saxons and Aryans are the most advanced and civilized people in the world, and they had the duty and the burden to Christianize and civilize the world's inferior people of color. Because people of color were inferior, however, they couldn't be uplifted to the same stage as white people. So this supremacist and paternal attitude was something that wasn't new in the United States, because if we look back during that time, slavery was present, and we also hadn't gone through the women's suffrage movement either. So many Americans had internalized these racial arguments in defense of slavery. Methodists looked at it as God was white and God's earthly image was destined to thrive and to rule. And so as the final authority for many in American society, they looked at this, especially the Methodists, that the Bible presented irrefutable evidence of racial hierarchy. So science and religion construct this racial hierarchy in the Methodist ministries that place the nature and the character of black people as the lowest rungs of humanity and white people in the highest rungs. Knowing about that, I look at the biases and I look at my great-grandparents, and they were slave owners, and they had little value, obviously, for people of color. And they had little tolerance for other people's belief. You were a Methodist, and that was the only belief that you should have. Women had minimal value. They weren't even educated in the Methodist doctrine at that time. They were supposed to take care of the house, not speak out of turn. And I found a letter from 1956 from my great-grandfather Claude wrote it, and it was about a woman who was granted full clergy rights in the Methodist religion, and my great-grandfather indicates that he's totally disdainful at this choice because it was a man's world. One of the things that was also important to learn that carried down from generation to generation is children were to be seen, not heard. They had to dress perfect, don't get dirty. Cleanliness is next to godliness, both in the home and with your children. And the father was the main disciplinarian, and it was hard and swift. Proverbs 13:24, spare the rod, spoil the child, was taken literally throughout the generations in my family. Methodism is also a denomination that emphasizes the heart, like when seeking to relate to God, which engenders a strong sense of humanitarianism and concern for the suffering of others. There's a strong sense of health and well-being in their doctrine. So when I look at this humanitarianism, there was a strong sense of empathy, but when I read things, it's only rigid empathy indicated by the belief that if you're not in perfect harmony with God, you'll have problems, and the best medicine is prayer, and only the love of God could bring forth peace and perfect calm, which led to their bias that you cannot be mentally ill. They believe that consuming tea or liquor, sleeping too long, failing to exercise, any of those could lead to mental disorders such as nervousness or depression, since physical and mental health were viewed as inextricably intertwined. We were taught, my great-grandparents taught their children that choices created who they are. Never was it okay to identify it as a pathological disorder. If you were an alcoholic or if you did drugs, those were your choices. In fact, the Methodists led the prohibition charge in the late 19th century because alcohol was identified with numerous social and physical harms. And intoxication was the wages of sin. I remember conversations with my grandma identifying her dad as a fire and brimstone preacher with God as his right-hand man, talking about that. And which is funny because alcoholism flooded through our centuries. So as I moved down the generations, obviously my grandfather and to my grandmother, you can see that their faith was no longer the Methodist. They became agnostic. And agnostic faith believes religious zealots are ignorant because of their blind following of a supreme being. So I was wondering if maybe being raised in a zealot environment may have contributed to my grandparents' departure from the faith. However, they may have departed from that religion, but they carried over some generational aspects, including my grandfather and my great grandfather, disciplinarian, heavy handed. He was violent with his ex wife, which potentially could have been a carryover from his childhood. He was extremely prejudiced, and you can see that across the races. And he was unable to understand others' perspectives. My grandfather believed all religions were hogwash and totally avoided talking about them. With that religious intolerance, my grandmother still bowed to her husband's will, and she allowed the rod to be used on her children. And she became really heavy-handed, especially after her divorce. And she definitely exhibited the characteristics of children were to be seen, not heard. In fact, there was no emotional expression allowed in my grandparents' family. They had an extreme dislike for religious people, and they didn't accept their children without fault. They had to act perfect, their behavior, their manners, their thoughts. It was like a clean house. Cleanliness is next to godliness, including the way that her children were viewed by others. My grandmother did bring some traditions forth, and I'm not sure if they came from the great grandparents or not, but some of those were like Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, and the birthdays. And those were all things that were established at that time as part of the cultural expectations that we did with some faith, even though they were agnostic. My aunt was the oldest of my family, and then my Uncle Jim and my Uncle Bob, and then, of course, my biological mother. And when you look at the different colors and the things that are around what their expectations, my aunt, you can see, carried high patterns of expectations. She was a heavy-handed disciplinarian. She refused to acknowledge mental illness. She had no tolerance for anyone who was of different color, socioeconomic status, or even for her own children's lack of perfection, which is something you can see is generational. She believed in that cleanliness is next to godliness. She had a total zero tolerance for alcohol, believed it was the root of all evil, and she did shift to the Catholic faith when her children were born. My Uncle Jim, on the other hand, accepted alcohol and drugs. I think he suffered from an unidentified mental illness, since, remember, it wasn't something that we were even allowed to discuss or think about or believed in. And he was extremely violent with his wife, and he was heavy-handed with his children. And he did stand by cleanliness is next to godliness, and he suffered for years with alcohol and drug dependency without family acknowledgement. And I think it could have been a potential mental illness. And he did convert to Christianity in the last years of his life. My Uncle Bob was an extreme pacifist, so total opposite of the Methodist and agnostic look. He suffered, I think, from unidentified depression, not something to be talked about in the family. Again, they don't believe in that. But he also suffered, which is a generational thing. My grandmother, I remember her doing the same thing, the elephant under the rug syndrome. No one talks about the issues. Everyone scoots around him, scrunches, moves to accommodate it, but nobody ever admits there's a gigantic elephant. So we couldn't admit there might have been alcoholism or mental illness. If we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. And he's the kind of, he accepts any and all behavior, and he doesn't do any cleaning, so total opposite. When I come down to my bio mom and you look at this here, she married into the Catholic faith, but she carried over Methodist beliefs, included the heavy-handedness, cleanliness is next to godliness, refusal to acknowledge mental illness, children were to be seen and not heard, we weren't allowed to have friends unless they were in high status. I remember being put on exhibition for others, and we had that elephant under the rug. Nothing's wrong in our family, it's perfect. But my bio mom did establish the same family traditions for Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, and birthdays that came from my grandmother. However, it was only immediate family, and I think it was due to all the elephants under the rug she was afraid might be exposed. So upon the Catholic faith over here, she married her second husband there in the Catholic faith. And the Catholic faith had a lot of rules and regulations, including the obedience of the husbands at all costs. So maybe this was a comfort zone that came down from the Methodist and then from her grandparents. Her parents. You have to follow the 10 Commandments, receive the 7 sacraments like baptism, confirmation, communion, confession. I remember having to do that, requiring the penance, saying the Hail Mary, Our Father, the Rosary, and then the way that marriages were held for hours in the churches. So with my bio mom and stepdad, their racism came out too. No other faith was acceptable. You had to marry in your race. You had to hide your wrongdoings. What happens in the home stays in the home. If you weren't baptized, you don't go to heaven. You had to participate in the rituals without the true meaning, like Easter service, midnight mass, Lent, confirmation, first communion. My parents never explored what these rituals were. We just participated, and they carried over that children had to do these things to look good for the parents. And again, in our home, emotional expression was not allowed, and the only thing that ever was expressed was rage, probably from pent up feelings, since emotion was forbidden. When I look into my step family, my brother Patrick and Ben and Katie, my brother Patrick followed the Catholic rituals until he separated from the church when he was 17, and he converted to the Christian faith when he was 35. But he carried over that heavy-handed discipline, hide your wrongdoings, what happens in the home stays in the home, stay married at all costs with no emotional expression. Whereas my brother Ben, he converted to agnostic with my sister. He expresses no emotion. He does have violent outbursts maybe associated with that, but he has been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, and nobody wants to, it's the elephant under the rug. Nobody identifies it. They keep it hidden in my family. No one accepts it. Most of our families cut him off, and he's gone anti-faith. And in his words, he said it was due to the hypocrisy exhibited in the family home, and he's very prejudiced. I mean, he's not only prejudiced, he thinks women have no value, and different races don't have good value either. My sister Katie exhibits that same with a pent-up rage. She's a heavy-handed disciplinarian, and she has mental health diagnoses as well, and most of my family cut her off. And she's also gone anti-faith, and she says too the hypocrisy. So as we travel down the generations, I come to coming down to myself. I was definitely born a Catholic, but then I converted and married as well into the Christian faith. And our faith is, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son, so whoever believes in him will have everlasting life. And it's all about forgiveness and how we're created in God's image, and God is loving and kind. We're accepted as human and have human behaviors, thoughts, and emotions. And love thy neighbor as thyself, which is completely against the behaviors that we're taught and some of the value systems. Not that those faiths that I've discussed before only have those values, but that's how they were expressed through the generations in my family. So my husband and children were born and raised in the Christian faith. They're really kind-hearted, caring. They express empathy for others. They're concerned about life as they live it according to the Bible. And my children are really forgiving and accept people where they are. However, as you see the racism card there with my husband, since 9/11, my children have struggled with my husband's carryover of racism into their world, and so have I. And then I look at my oldest, who converted to agnostic at 15. Her biological father is an atheist, wherein he has a wide range of beliefs and his own moral standards independent of God. And he tends to see the world only through one lens and really struggles to accept others where they're at. So my oldest is struggling against these two diametrically opposed concepts of Christianity and atheism. Then I go back to myself and I believe marriage is a lifetime commitment, possibly carried over through the generations. And I struggle with the expression of emotion. And I'm conflict avoidant, as evidenced by my parental and grandparent attitudes. That's what I learned. I exhibit the elephant under the rug symptoms, and I've had to work hard on breaking that pattern. I always think, how can I be successful in my therapeutic endeavors if I'm in conflict avoidant and allow these symptoms to continue? So I've struggled with perfectionism, tendencies to put godliness and cleanliness in the same breath, and the expectations of perfection for myself and my children. I've been able to overcome the anger associated with this inability to express emotion. And I know I don't condone a heavy hand for child rearing, and I believe children have a voice and are as much a part of the household as the adults. I've carried on the family Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, and birthday celebrations, but I extend my invitation to friends and those that are less fortunate. I was even known in my teens and 20s to invite homeless and less fortunate people to special events. I reject all these racial philosophies that have carried over through the generations, standing on the precipice that all men are created in God's image. But I still see racism evident in today's society, and even at church, I see a class difference among the wealthy and poverty-stricken people. So growing up in a racist family, my eyes have been opened, and I don't stand with the dominant culture on this. And the reason I'm bringing all that out now is because I know we were going to discuss some of this in class, so I thought I would bring it forth in my presentation. And then I look at the counselor part of me and where the generational, they called them generations of sin, would have come down, or generations of growth, or generational patterns. When I decided to become a counselor, I struggled with my faith because of the bias I had regarding abortion, and I didn't believe I could counsel someone who's looking for an abortion. My faith is strong, and I believe in the right to life. Nothing's an accident, so I take this viewpoint into the counseling field, and I'm still not sure how I would approach the situation if it were to occur. But a positive that came out of my religious background is that I'm understanding and tolerant for people of different faith. Maybe my family wasn't over the generations, but I definitely am, and I'm tolerant of others' opinions, perspectives, beliefs. And I believe I can be non-biased when working with religious populations. The support, excuse me, the support of my family, my pastor, and my friends has been great. My husband believes this profession is the one that's going to benefit me greatly, as well as the clients. And so I look at this and I try to see the strengths that I've possessed through the years, or that I've gained over the years, with being raised in the philosophies and the values and the beliefs of the different face. And one of the strengths I believe that I do possess is one of diversity because of this. I know I've worked with juvenile delinquents, I've worked with sex offenders, I've taught kindergarten through high school, I've taught high-risk students, I've worked with the mentally ill, and I currently take care of my elderly grandma. So working with these populations has provided me with some wisdom to the inner workings of people, which I think is going to be invaluable in my career. I really believe my faith has increased my ability to relate to all facets of life, and it keeps me grounded in a belief that all people are good. So now that I've been able to identify my religious affiliations, my family of origin bias, and barriers to my success as a counselor, I'm hoping to have my eyes opened even more of the influences in my thinking patterns. And I look forward to doing more self-exploration to continue to identify my biases and increase my effectiveness as a counselor. Thank you for joining me in this presentation. And I hope if you have any questions, you'll feel free to text and I can respond immediately. Thank you.